So in joining LBC in the advocacy role, the first thing to do was decide what do we prioritise in terms of advocacy initiatives. And to do that, we reflected on the patient survey that some of you may have been involved with. And what came out really strongly was that medicines access was a really important item that patients wanted to see LBC more involved in. So when we're thinking about medicines access and advocating for better medicines access, we're focusing both on specific medicines and disease groups that haven't had new medications funded for a long time. But we're also looking at the systematic changes required to pharmac and to the way we think about medicines and fund medicines so that we can sustainably deliver better medicines for people when they need it. So I should probably preface this by saying this is very much from the perspective of patients, this talk. It may differ from the views of pharmac and of industry, but pharmac will be here in the next hour or so to answer some of the curlier questions if you have any brewing. So I will have a bit of time at the end as well to answer any questions from you specifically. So in order to understand the process, I think it's important to reflect on key three things. What's the purpose of medicine decision making? What are the principles? And what is the process? And by doing this, the aim is to really empower you to be able to input into medicine decision making, if that's something that is of interest to you. It's also helpful for you to understand what changes you need to advocate for when we're looking to change our processes for medicine decision making. So reflecting on how we compare versus international best practice, ways in which we should look to improve in order to optimize our process. Now, it's important to think about how our healthcare system is financed when we're thinking about how we decide which medicines are funded. Every country will take a different approach. So the US, I think we've got pretty good awareness that it's mostly private medical insurance. It means we've got coverage to many more medicines, but at a significant cost to the people involved. New Zealand's quite different in that 70% of our population don't have any form of private health insurance. For the other 30% that do, only 3% are fully insured for medicines. So that means that even those with private health insurance, many are only partially funded for medicines. There's often a cap, a pretty conservative cap, and it's probably a different talk in terms of what value some of our private health insurers are realistically offering us. But I think for the purpose of today, the key takeaway there is that the vast majority of New Zealand are reliant on pharmac fund the medicines that they need. So pharmac are New Zealand's Health Technology Assessment Agency, or HTA is an acronym that I'll be using throughout this talk. And they're responsible for determining which drugs are available through the public health system. So HTA is a process that looks at whether a treatment is good value for money and whether it's worth funding for the public. It helps to decide if using taxpayers' money is a good use in order to improve health outcomes and to improve how the health system operates. Now, it gets a bit niggly when you're talking about value for money in terms of medicines, because obviously any medicine that extends life or improves your quality of life is really valuable to the person who needs it. Where health economics comes in is trying to determine whether or not that therapy offers additional value versus what is currently used, and it also helps to ensure that funds are distributed equally across different disease types. So when health economists are assessing the value of a medicine, they're looking at how the costs and benefits weigh up, and they're looking at how the price of the medicine compares to the health improvements that it makes. So a medicine might be really high cost, but if it offers a lot of benefit to the patient, to the health system, then it's still very much value for money. So deciding to pay for one medicine might mean less money for other treatments, and health economists are making sure that we're getting the most benefit out of every dollar that's being spent. Now, these are the 3 core tenets of health technology assessment, and they're attributes that you'll often see reflected in very established HTA agencies worldwide, particularly the UK, which was sort of the birthplace of health economics. The first one is independence. So the assessment process that produces a recommendation for funding should be independent, it should be unbiased, it's based on evidence, and it's not prone to external pressure, it's not subject to the whims of politicians or from industry lobbying or even patient group lobbying. It helps to ensure that the process is fair and objective and that the evaluations can be trusted. It should also be transparent, so all of the data and the methods and the opinions that have gone into assessing a medicine should be made publicly available so that everyone can understand how a decision has been made. And that transparency is really critical for ensuring that there's trust in the system. And lastly, it should be credible. So the process should be based on really reliable and rigorous methods, and it should be reviewing all available evidence to make sure that the assessment is thorough and that it's accurate. And this means that patients and the healthcare system can rely on that process to make the best decision for which medicines should be funded for them. I'm a little bit frozen. Here we go. Oh. Now, the outcome of health technology assessment is medicine access. And it's important when we're thinking about what influences medicine access, there are 3 key factors, and that's evidence, price, and time. Now, these all interact with each other, and the outcome of all of this determines how quickly and affordably a patient can access a new medicine. And each country will take this on differently. So before I previously mentioned the US, which is financed very differently to New Zealand. It's a lot of private health insurance. They're willing to pay a premium to get really fast access to a new medicine, even when the evidence is quite immature. New Zealand take a very different approach in that we're willing to wait a very long time for the price to come down in order to make it available for New Zealanders. So it's an important aspect of our attitude towards medicines that I think we need to be aware of in terms of what's happening here. So the government and 2 key health agencies are all involved in determining medicine access in New Zealand. MedSafe are our regulatory authority. They will do a risk-benefit assessment, so they're looking at the safety profile of the therapy compared to its efficacy and determining whether or not it's safe for use in New Zealand. Once a product is MedSafe approved, it then has marketing authorization and it can be distributed both in the public and private healthcare system. Pharmac's assessment is quite different. So Pharmac are doing a clinical and cost effectiveness review, and they're deciding which medicines to fund within the fixed budget that's available to them. Now, the broader government has a really important role in all of this as well, because it is setting the budget each year. And by setting Pharmac's budget, it's determining how many new medicines can be funded. So I think it's important to recognise a lot of our discontent is targeted towards Pharmac, but Pharmac are very much operating within their strategic objective. And actually, what we probably need is a broader commitment from government to invest more heavily in medicines. So this is a screenshot from the Pharmac website. I'm hoping none of you have to be involved in the entire process from start to finish because it's tedious. But Pharmac have made efforts in recent times to be more transparent about what their process involves. So if you go onto their website, there's lots of really fantastic information, and I would highly recommend giving it a read if that happens to be an interest of yours. But in the interest of brevity, I'll just cover some of the key parts of the process. So first of all, there'll be a submission to Pharmac for a new medicine to be funded, and that submission will either come from a drug company, it can come from a clinician, and it can even come from patients. So if you've got a particular interest in a drug being funded for you, you can prepare a submission to Pharmac. When Pharmac receive that application, they then prepare some clinical advice papers. They're a bit like board papers, and they'll go to an advisory committee who will review that application and provide a recommendation. Now, those advisory committees, there's several of them. The main one is PTAC, or the Pharmacology and Therapeutics Advisory Committee, and the specialty one for cancer medicines is CTAC, or Cancer Therapeutics Advisory Committee. CTAC actually have really great representation from haematologists. I think there's about 4 haematologists on that advisory committee. So there is, a high level of expertise in forming some of those recommendations. Once the committee provides a recommendation, that application will then sit on the options for investment list. So this is a list you may have heard of in the media. It's sometimes referred to the list of shame because it's not really a list that should exist. If there are experts who've provided a positive recommendation for funding, it should immediately be funded. Instead, that product will sit on this list until there is funding available. And this is often the greatest hurdle in the process. Some applications sit on that list for as many as 6 years. I think it's probably a matter of intense tension amongst different patient advocacy groups in terms of the time taken to wait for something that's clearly valuable. And the reason it takes so long is the government setting the budget each year and determining how far down the options for investment list we can clear. There's been recent advancements in terms of budget for Pharmac, which you may have seen in the news, and I'll get to that shortly. But these 2 elements are very unique to New Zealand. Other countries won't have a fixed budget. They will maintain their budget and have particular price negotiation mechanisms in order to make sure that it's not blowing out. But New Zealand are quite unique in that they're restricting expenditure to this degree. The other important piece is the timing at which the broader public are invited to consult on a funding decision. So once the government has finally provided funding for a medicine, you may have seen public consultations go out to say, Pharmac would like to propose to fund this drug and they want your feedback. And that's really helpful because it provides the public a chance to say what that drug will mean for them, to highlight any implications of funding it, and really make sure that when it is introduced to the New Zealand healthcare system, that we're fully aware of any of the considerations of doing so. Where things are done differently in other countries is that consultation happens much earlier, and it's actually used to help decide or inform the recommendation for funding. So it would usually happen at this advisory committee stage. The advisory committee would provide a recommendation and the public will be consulted on it. So if they were to give a negative recommendation, the public would then have an opportunity to comment on that. And that just means that when the New Zealand public are being asked to comment on it, they're not really influencing the funding decision. They're just funding minor aspects of the access criteria. So again, another screenshot from the Pharmac website. This is a broad range of aspects that are used to determine value of a medicine. This is how Pharmac are measuring whether or not a medicine will be valuable for the New Zealanders who need it. It is very thorough, it's very comprehensive. They're looking at 4 main domains. So you've got the health benefits, that's the health benefits to the person, family and wider society, and the health system. It's also looking at costs and savings, so whether or not it creates savings for the health system, savings for the patient, and you've also got suitability and need. So what does that patient group currently have access to? What is the need there? And all of these are done through 3 main perspectives. That's a perspective of the patient's family and society, and the healthcare system. Now, it's also important to recognise that Pharmac's statutory objective is to maximise health outcomes within the amount of funding provided to them. So everything is done with a lens of budget management. And this means that the main value driver when they're doing these determinations are the costs and savings to pharmaceutical expenditure. And this is why sometimes we see drugs that are really economically effective. They improve health outcomes, they reduce health system resource utilisation, they reduce caregiver burden, but the budget that pharmac has won't allow them to fund it. So this type of budget management is prioritising short-term financial relief rather than the upfront investment needed to see long-term economic and societal benefits. And that's why you don't see other healthcare systems doing it, because it's a false economy. It's a bit like, I had a friend once say to me, it's really expensive to be poor. It's like when you buy shoes from the warehouse and they're really cheap and they disintegrate within a year versus paying a lot more for something that lasts you several years. It's very much weighted towards short-term financial relief. So what happens when an application has gone through that process, the value's been determined, there's a positive recommendation, now it sits on the options for investment list. So when a medicine is placed on the options for investment list, it's signalling to drug companies that pharmac are interested, but they're not yet committing to funding it. So the applications on the list are public. Everyone can see, you can search online and see what is sitting on that list, but you don't know how it's ranked. So it's ranked in order of prioritization. And this creates competitive tensions for the drug companies who are competing for budget because they can see that there's a comparator drug, they want to get funded before that. So it helps as a negotiation mechanism. By delaying funding, pharmac can negotiate better deals and they can push companies to offer lower prices. So when additional budget is available, medicines are then funded from the list based on their priority ranking. So when we're thinking about that triangle of evidence, price, and time, by the time it's on the OFI, we've got the evidence. It's just a matter of time and bringing the price down. So it's, the cost of that type of negotiation is human lives, and I think that's why we often call the OFI the list of shame, because price negotiation should never really happen that way, and that's why we don't see other countries use it. On the OFI at the moment, when I last checked, maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, there were over 130 applications awaiting funding. There's a 6-year average waiting time for over 90 medicines, and majority of those medicines are considered standard of care in other countries. But you may have seen earlier this year, there was a $604 million budget uplift to pharmac, which was obviously a matter of immense excitement. Within that budget, we were promised 26 cancer medicines and even medicines for 4 different blood cancers. Again, if you're willing to really get into the weeds of the pharmac website, you'll be able to find this information. But obviously what we don't know is what those 4 different blood cancer medicines will be. We've got no clarity on what can be included within that, when it might be funded. We know that there's been Keytruda for Hodgkin lymphoma, but we're not sure what the other ones are. Will it provide an opportunity for myeloma patients to have a new treatment option for when they next relapse, or CLL patients to have more effective treatment options? And this is really hard for patients who are trying to plan their care and think about future medicine availability. Now, this is the outcome of our process, and you may have heard taglines to the effect of New Zealand has the worst medicines access in the OECD. So the OECD is an Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a great benchmark because they're all economies that measure in a similar manner to New Zealand. We would expect to be performing similarly to them. This particular analysis was looking at 460 medicines that launched globally in the decade between 2012 and 2021. So across OECD nations, the average number of these medicines that were publicly funded was 29%. So almost a third of all of those medicines that were launched were publicly funded as the OECD average. New Zealand is vastly different to that. We only funded 7% of those. So we often have a scarcity mindset and a low level of ambition when it comes to medicine investment in New Zealand. But this type of comparison is important because it forces us to ask the question, are we more poor than Turkey, than Mexico, Lithuania? And in short, no. So this is a comparison, and it's the last boring graph. I don't know how much of it you can actually see, but this is medicine expenditure as a proportion of gross domestic product. And again, it's looking at the OECD nations. So the OECD national average is 1.4% of GDP is attributed to medicine expenditure. New Zealand don't actually fulfill their reporting obligations to the OECD, so this has been back calculated, but I can assure you that it is a reliable estimate. We're far lower than that OECD average, sitting at about 0.4% of our GDP being allocated to medicines. So our underinvestment is intentional. It's because the value of medicines isn't fully recognised by our government. Pharmac is simply the vehicle that's used to maintain that under-expenditure. So who is affected by access to medicines? In short, everyone is, because at any point in our lives we will fall sick and we will rely on the public health system to deliver medicines for us. But particularly patients, and many of you will have personal experiences with this, where you're relying on access to medicines to improve health outcomes, your ability to work, be present for your family, your quality of life. When you don't have the right access to medicines, it can force you to be more reliant on other healthcare services and other social support systems, whether that's caregivers at home or MSD. It can also create the added stress of either needing to self-fund or advocate for funding of standard of care therapies whilst you're already coping with illness. It also affects clinicians in quite a significant way, because it means that the funded options that they have available to them might not necessarily align with internationally recognised guidelines. It also creates ethical challenges because clinicians are in the position of having to decide which patients they can discuss unfunded options with. Self-funding a medication won't be an option for everyone, and it's a sensitive topic to broach. It also creates an incentive to move overseas in order to gain better clinical experience. If you're if you're a clinician wanting to advance your career, you want to have experience with the latest developments in clinical care, and you're not going to get them in New Zealand. For pharmaceutical companies, there's a major disincentivization from supplying medicines or conducting clinical trials in New Zealand. So a lot of pharmaceutical companies won't have New Zealand clinical trial sites for many reasons, partly due to us not having the baseline level of exposure to standard of care therapies in order to be eligible for clinical trials. But also we don't have a clear route to funded access, so there's no sense of commercial viability. This also means that some pharmaceutical companies won't submit their medicines to MedSafe, which means even people wanting to self-fund or access a medicine through the private healthcare system can't do that. To do that submission to MedSafe costs something in the magnitude of $100,000. And when there's no clarity that Pharmac will fund your medicine, it's not considered commercially viable to drug companies. For the healthcare system, it experiences an increased strain on healthcare services, and this can include more frequent doctor visits, hospital admissions, and prolonged hospital stays. And for the wider economy, it means we have reduced productivity due to poorer health outcomes, but we also have minimal contribution to global R&D efforts and limited availability of clinical trials. So, how does pharmac compare to other HTA or health technology assessment agencies? Just as a brief summary, in New Zealand, pharmac is responsible for both determining the value of a medicine and for managing the budget. So normally in other countries, those two functions would be separate. And the impact of that is that the impact of the budget that the medicine has overshadows all other value measures. We also have technology assessment reports, so the technical summary of why a medicine is on the OFI and the major pieces of evidence informing its ranking on the OFI are not published. They are available using the Official Information Act, but this means that the public are not aware of the factors informing funding decisions. So a key example is earlier in the year, there was a public consultation for pomalidomide in multiple myeloma. A lot of clinicians were saying, yes, it's a helpful treatment option, we need it, but we're not entirely sure what the survival advantage might be for New Zealanders. I tried to OIA it. Pharmac did not respond to that, and I still have not received it. So, you can't really meaningfully comment on a consultation because you don't know the evidence that they've used to make that decision. So when we're thinking about our three core tenets of HTA, we know that we've lost independence because we're biased by the budget, by the cost of a medicine. We know that we're compromising the transparency by not publishing major aspects of the decision-making process. And then we've got our value framework that I showed you before, which isn't used in a systematic way, where measures have variable weighting on the resulting funding decision, and that impacts the credibility of the process. I also touched on some of the other aspects, so that fixed budget and the generation of an options for investment list, which means that we don't always fund cost-effective medicines. We also don't have defined timelines in our process, so there's no clarity for people needing to plan for future medicine availability. And we don't have public consultation during the assessment phase of the process. So public feedback is not influencing the final funding decision. I've lost a bit of formatting here, but I think the top line meaning can come across. So when Sean introduced me before, he mentioned my first foray into health technology assessment in the UK, and that was on the daratumumab submission to NICE, who was the UK Health Technology Assessment Agency. This was daratumumab in combination with bortezomib and dexamethasone. I've had a few years to get that right. And there may be a few myeloma patients in the room who are interested in knowing when daratumumab will be funded by pharmac. It is a question that we are going to ask pharmac in the session after this, so I don't have the answer to that, sorry, but no. But at the very least, I can give you a bit of an overview of the process that's happened in the UK and how it's compared to New Zealand, just so you've got a bit of context. So same combination, same indication, submitted at the similar time in the UK and New Zealand, but went through very different processes in each of the countries. So starting in the UK, the submission goes in late 2017. 6 months later, there's a committee meeting. The committee review all the evidence and they decide to give a negative recommendation. Now, at the time, the clinical trial data was pretty immature. Daratumumab was a game-changing medication, but the patients in the trial were living too long, so they couldn't meet the median overall survival. One of the unfortunate features of a very effective medicine. So there are other ways to address that uncertainty, to provide modelling and really predict what those survival outcomes are likely to be. But having that statistical analysis and understanding of what that median overall survival is really important to some people as well. So in the follow-up committee meeting, another 6 months later, November 2018, the Janssen, the pharmaceutical company, were able to address a lot of that uncertainty. They were also able to adjust the pricing, which makes some of the uncertainty a bit more bearable. And the committee ultimately provided a positive recommendation. Now, 3 months later, daratumumab was then funded by the NHS. And that's built into legislation in the UK that within 3 months of NICE making a positive recommendation, that medicine has to be provided by the NHS. So when daratumumab was first funded in the UK, it was done so through the Cancer Drugs Fund. And this is a ring-fenced funding that's specifically designed for new cancer medicines where the evidence may not be fully mature. And it's done so with the requirement that within a couple years later, the company has to resubmit data, confirm that the drug is effective, and then it's routinely funded through the normal funding pool. So daratumumab is now funded through routine reimbursement at NICE. In New Zealand, we submitted at the same time, November 2017, and had the first committee meeting a few months later in April 2018. Now, the committee decided to defer that application on the basis of that clinical trial data not being mature. The next meeting was almost a year later, in February 2019, and again, the committee decided to defer the application on the basis of data immaturity. It's important to recognise at this point it has actually received a positive recommendation by NICE and is imminently about to be funded. Another 6 months later, there's a third committee meeting, and we finally get a low recommendation for daratumumab. Another year later, we have another committee meeting because apparently we needed it. At this point, it's been funded in the UK for about a year, and I will say it's funded in the UK based on clinical and economic effectiveness. Again, it receives a low recommendation. In July 2021, there's a fifth committee meeting. It does get a high recommendation. So at this point, it's been funded in the UK for over 3 years, and the evidence is well established. So it shows differences in willingness to address clinical uncertainty in the data. It's a very good question. There's someone behind you who I'm sure would love to answer that. Yeah, so it has been set on the options for investment list as something that Pharmac would like to fund when they have the money to do so. Since July 2021, Myeloma New Zealand have presented to Pharmac. This was a massive step forward in terms of patient engagement in the decision-making process. I don't know if many of you have met Nicola Oakenfield or Barbara Horn, two very passionate and, yeah, they deserve a round of applause. Yeah, two very passionate ladies who worked hard to make sure that their voices and perspectives could be considered in that process. So they had the opportunity to present to Pharmac's advisory committee in November 2022. Yeah, almost 2 years on, still no outcome to that meeting, but we hold out hope. So the key difference there is that in the UK process, Myeloma UK were invited by NICE to be present at that committee meeting. So they were sat at the table, involved in the discussion as the discussion was happening. They were able to provide feedback in live time around what some of those economic modelling assumptions meant to them and what the real life aspects of that drug meant for them. So it just meant that the patient voice was incorporated very differently in the UK versus New Zealand. And if we're looking at what we might want to advocate for ourselves, it would be that earlier involvement and a seat at the table. I seem to have frozen again. Cool, so as a quick summary, when comparing both processes, and the formatting's gone a bit strange, the But the UK, they were able to make the decision within 2 committee meetings. In New Zealand, we've had 5. In the UK, there was a positive recommendation within 1 year of submission. And in New Zealand, it took us almost 2 years to get to a low recommendation. In the UK, funding was provided 3 months after a positive recommendation. And in New Zealand, we're 5 years post our first positive recommendation, and we still don't have funding. In the UK, the process from start to finish, in terms of submission to having it funded and available for patients, was 18 months. In New Zealand, we're, I think, almost at 7 years and still unfunded. And lastly, and I mentioned this before, but I think it's important to double down on, NICE proactively invited Myeloma UK to be present at the committee meetings and contributing to the discussion. And this meant that they could influence the funding recommendation. Pharmac, kindly but reactively invited Myeloma New Zealand to present to the committee. And this was at a point in time at which the funding discussions had already taken place, the recommendations had already been made. So the ability to influence that was minimal. Now, I want to finish on a brighter note because it isn't all doom and gloom. And there's always opportunities for change and opportunities for improvement, and we are seeing that actively happen. So the Minister of Pharmac, David Seymour, earlier this year provided a letter of expectations that defined changes that needed to happen to Pharmac. And these were very clearly defined, and they really set the scene for what the future of Pharmac could entail. And this really clearly commented on strengthening stakeholder engagement and collaboration, and we're already seeing positive steps towards that, which includes Pharmac being present with us today to have some of these discussions. It also mentioned reviewing Pharmac's statutory objective. So is there a future in which we're not operating within this capped budget and scarcity mindset? And it's also looking at improving methods and processes, which would hopefully mean that we can address clinical uncertainty in the same sorts of ways that our international counterparts do. And on the right here is a really exciting collaboration that happened with Pharmac and other global HTA agencies earlier last year, and that was an international collaboration intended to bring experts from all around the globe to look at ways in which we can improve our processes and share experiences. New Zealand they're not the only people doing this. We don't need to do it on our own. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And there's fantastic collaborations at play that ensure that we can utilize the understanding and expertise of others to make better decisions. Okay, with that, I'll pass over to the floor for a few questions.